The words dropped like a hammer. "Unfit," Peterson declared, his voice cutting through the air like a blade designed to wound. It wasn't just a critique. It wasn't just an insult. It was a verdict, delivered with the self-assured smugness of a man who believed no one in that room could challenge him. The hall fell silent for a heartbeat, the kind of silence that doesn't simply mean people stopped talking. It meant they stopped breathing. Eyes darted, jaws tightened. A collective ripple of disbelief spread like an invisible wave. To some, Peterson's words confirmed their suspicions. To others, they landed as a gut punch, a stinging reminder of the arrogance that too often cloaks itself in authority. Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. Not yet. The camera lenses zoomed, the flashes timed like staccato beats of a drum, framing her face against the heavy pause. Her eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger but in calculation, as though she were memorizing every syllable, storing every ounce of disdain in a vault that would later be unlocked with precision. For Peterson, this was theater. He leaned back in his chair, shoulders squared, the faintest smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. He wanted this to sting, to stick, to travel beyond the room and plant itself in headlines and comment sections. His supporters chuckled nervously, eager to echo his authority, but wary of the sharpness in the air. The audience split in two. On one side, applause, hesitant, then louder. On the other, murmurs of disapproval, whispers of, "Did he really just say that?" and "She doesn't deserve this." The tension thickened, palpable, a storm cloud forming above polished wooden tables and carefully pressed suits. Crockett adjusted her mic, not speaking yet, but the movement alone pulled every gaze toward her. The silence deepened again. The kind of silence that meant anticipation had overtaken shock. Even those ready to cheer Peterson's takedown leaned forward, hungry to see if she would recoil or retaliate. And yet, she said nothing. Not yet. She let the insult hang, let it grow heavy, let the crowd wrestle with its weight. Because Crockett knew something that Peterson, in all his certainty, could not imagine. But no one in that room could have predicted what Crockett had hidden up her sleeve. This was no ordinary gathering. The room itself carried the weight of history, the kind of place where reputations are carved into marble or shattered beyond repair. A televised forum, broadcast across the nation, framed by sleek lights and banners that promised civil discourse but delivered time and again the spectacle of intellectual combat. Politicians, journalists, academics, and ordinary citizens filled the seats, each carrying their own expectations of what the night might reveal. For Jordan Peterson, the stakes were personal but familiar. He thrived in these environments. With a following already primed to cheer his every takedown, this was another chance to reinforce the persona of an uncompromising truth-teller. To dismiss, to declare, to dominate. That was his rhythm. By branding Jasmine Crockett unfit, he wasn't just critiquing her ideas, he was attempting to reduce her very legitimacy, to strip her of the credibility that anchored her rise. For Crockett, however, this was not simply about one insult. The moment was larger than her, larger than Peterson, larger than the stage. She represented more than just her district, more than just her political record. She stood as a symbol for women who had been told they were too loud, for immigrants, children who had been told they didn't belong, for communities too often dismissed as unworthy of power. To sit silently under the weight of Peterson's verdict would mean affirming the narrative that dignity can be mocked, that service can be erased with one arrogant phrase. The cameras never blinked. Producers knew they had captured a flashpoint, the kind of clash that sparks hashtags and monologues on late-night shows. Each angle framed Peterson's posture of superiority against Crockett's measured stillness, the contrast almost cinematic. The stakes extended beyond the hall, millions watching at home, millions more who would see the clips on social media, waiting to decide for themselves who carried the truth. And truth, in that moment, hung by a thread. If Peterson's words went unanswered, they would echo as gospel in the echo chambers of his followers. If Crockett faltered, her critics would seize it as proof that she was overwhelmed, outmatched, unfit by his decree. This was not about debate points. It was about narrative control. It was about who would walk away as the voice of reason and who would be branded the villain of the night. The atmosphere thickened with tension. Journalists scribbled furiously, sensing the story expanding in front of them. Members of the audience exchanged looks, some biting their lips, others clutching at their phones to record every second. Even those who came with no stake in the outcome felt the gravity of what was unfolding. It was no longer entertainment. It was history in the making, compressed into a single charged exchange. And through it all, Crockett remained unshaken. To the untrained eye, her silence seemed like restraint. To those who knew better, it was something far more dangerous: patience. She was waiting, letting Peterson believe he had set the terms of engagement. In reality, she was preparing to redefine them entirely, because while Peterson relied on the theatrics of arrogance, Crockett carried something far heavier, an unspoken truth, sharpened and ready to cut through the noise. And when the tension hit its breaking point, the insult became the spark that ignited everything. To understand why Jordan Peterson's declaration carried such venom, you have to understand the man himself. For years, he had built a reputation as the master of dismissal, the intellectual pugilist who thrived not on collaboration but on confrontation. His voice carried the cadence of authority, his words wrapped in the language of philosophy and psychology, but beneath that veneer, critics argued, was something far simpler: an unyielding elitism, sharpened against anyone who dared to contradict. He rose to prominence in a storm of controversy, and he liked it that way. From his early fights over cultural politics to his constant sparring with progressive leaders, Peterson positioned himself as the arbiter of what was fit and unfit for society. He claimed to despise identity politics, yet wielded his own brand of identity-driven appeal, a cult of personality built on the idea that he alone saw through the delusions of modern culture. His followers adored him for it, flocking to his lectures and books, repeating his words like scripture in online forums. But what made Peterson so polarizing was not simply his ideas. It was his arrogance in delivering them. He rarely debated in search of understanding. Instead, he debated to conquer, to humiliate, to leave his opponents visibly rattled while he sat cool and detached. To his fans, this looked like confidence. To his detractors, it looked like cruelty. And when he leaned forward that night and called Jasmine Crockett unfit, it was not a departure from his character. It was the purest expression of it. Contradictions trailed him everywhere. He spoke of personal responsibility, yet often dismissed systemic injustice as an illusion. He demanded civility while unleashing insults that cut at the heart of people's identities. He wrapped himself in the language of free speech, yet bristled at criticism, casting his detractors as hysterical or misguided. This pattern, repeated over and over, made him a lightning rod. He thrived on being despised as much as he thrived on being adored. And in the media ecosystem, that duality was fuel. Outrage created clicks, and clicks created power. Peterson understood the economy of attention better than most. He knew how to turn every confrontation into a headline, every insult into a viral clip. By the time he looked at Crockett and delivered his verdict, he wasn't just speaking to the room. He was speaking to the millions who would later cheer him on YouTube, Twitter, and podcasts, amplifying his words far beyond their original stage. But arrogance always carries a blind spot. Peterson believed he was untouchable in these arenas, that his sharp rhetoric and intellectual posturing would always grant him the upper hand. He had taken down students, journalists, and even fellow academics, leaving them stumbling in his wake. Yet what he failed to see was how predictable he had become. His brand of elitist dismissal had turned into a script, and audiences were beginning to notice. Calling someone like Crockett unfit was not just an insult, it was a window into Peterson's limitations. It revealed his reliance on undermining others rather than elevating his own arguments. It exposed his inability or refusal to recognize dignity in those outside his ideological sphere. To his followers, the moment may have seemed like strength. To everyone else, it looked like desperation, masquerading as authority. The arrogance was not without cost. Critics across the globe had catalogued his contradictions, pointing out how often his lofty ideals collapsed under scrutiny. They noted how his speeches about order and discipline often ignored the messy realities of people who lived outside his privileged lens. They exposed how his declarations of truth frequently wobbled when challenged by lived experience. Yet, despite the mounting criticism, Peterson leaned into the role of villain. He enjoyed being the foil to progressive movements, the lone figure who dared to say what others feared. He cultivated the image of a man unbothered by backlash, yet beneath the surface, each clash chipped away at the myth of invincibility. And on that night, when he turned his gaze toward Crockett, the performance was the same as always, a declaration meant to sting, a verdict meant to resonate, a smirk meant to signal victory. But what he could not anticipate was that the script he had relied on for so long was about to fail him, because while Peterson's arrogance was nothing new, Crockett's journey told a very different story. Jasmine Crockett's story did not begin on polished stages or under camera lights. It began in the quiet corners of communities too often overlooked, places where struggle was not an exception, but the everyday reality. Raised in a world that told her again and again that power was not meant for people who looked like her, Crockett learned early that survival required resilience and dignity demanded defiance. She was no stranger to being underestimated. Teachers, employers, and neighbors had at times looked at her with doubt before she even spoke. Yet every doubt became fuel. She built her career brick by brick, first as a public defender, where she stood beside those society deemed disposable. She fought for voices that would otherwise be silenced, for names that would never trend on social media but mattered all the same. She saw firsthand how justice could be denied to the poor, how laws could crush instead of protect. And she made herself a shield. Her journey into politics was not born of ambition for spotlight or status. It was born of necessity. Too many in her community had no advocate. Too many had leaders who promised progress but delivered indifference. Crockett ran not to be celebrated but to serve, to ensure that her constituents had someone who spoke their language, who felt their struggles in her bones. Every victory at the ballot box was not hers alone. It belonged to the single mother who worked 2 jobs, to the immigrant family piecing together their American dream, to the young people who believed politics was a game rigged against them. Against that backdrop, Peterson's insult carried more than casual disdain. It was the latest echo of every time someone had tried to tell Crockett that her voice was too sharp, her background too humble, her identity too inconvenient. But what Peterson framed as unfit was, in truth, the very thing that had prepared her for battle. She was forged in struggle, while he was cushioned in ivory towers. He spoke from lecture halls. She spoke from lived experience. He trafficked in theories. She carried scars. Crockett's story was also one of transformation. She turned her own challenges into inspiration for others. She stood before audiences and reminded them that representation is not just symbolic, it is survival. When she spoke about policy, it was never abstract. It was tied to faces, families, lives she had defended in courtrooms and protected in legislatures. Her words carried the authenticity that no PhD or best-selling book could replicate, and people noticed. Her rise was not meteoric in the sense of overnight fame, but steady and unshakable. Every debate, every town hall, every campaign trail moment added to her credibility. By the time she took her seat on that stage with Peterson, She was not merely another politician in the crowd. She was a figure who embodied defiance, a reminder that the halls of power were no longer the sole domain of the privileged. The contrast between the two could not have been sharper. Peterson relied on dismissal. Crockett relied on empathy. He framed arguments to belittle. She framed them to uplift. His arrogance alienated, her authenticity connected. When he sneered, "unfit," he was revealing the limits of his worldview, one in which power is a tool of exclusion. Crockett, by contrast, represented the truth that power can be shared, that dignity belongs to all, and yet Crockett's composure was not naive. She knew the risks. She knew that women like her, women of color, women who dared to speak boldly, were always subjected to harsher scrutiny. One misstep could be amplified. One stumble could be weaponized. The burden was heavier, the expectations steeper. But carrying burdens was nothing new to her. She had been carrying them all her life. On that stage, as Peterson tried to cast her aside, Crockett's entire story stood behind her. Every courtroom defense, every campaign stop, every time she was told she couldn't, and proved that she could. She embodied a lineage of resistance, of voices that refused to be erased. Her calm in the face of his insult was not silence. It was strategy, born of years learning that the most powerful responses are often the ones delivered with precision and patience. Her rise was not an accident. It was earned, carved against the grain of a system that wanted her to fail. And it was precisely this resilience that prepared her for the moment when Peterson tried to crush her. The silence that followed Peterson's insult lingered, stretching across the hall like a taut wire ready to snap. Then came the murmur, an audible ripple of whispers, gasps, and hurried note scribbling as the crowd processed what they had just witnessed. Cameras pivoted like predators circling prey, desperate to capture the next move, the next expression, the next tremor that could define the evening. Peterson leaned into his microphone, his tone slow, deliberate, as though savoring the taste of his own words. "Unfit," he repeated, drawing out the syllables like a professor scolding an unprepared student. His eyes narrowed, fixed on Crockett with the intensity of someone convinced the debate was already over. He gestured lightly with his hand, a dismissive flick of the wrist that carried the weight of superiority. To him, this was the coup de grace, the line that would echo across headlines and feeds before the night was through. But Crockett didn't bite. She sat upright, shoulders squared, hands folded calmly on the table. She neither flinched nor fumed. Her stillness was striking, especially against Peterson's performance of dominance. The contrast alone deepened the tension. One man vibrating, with smug energy, one woman radiating unshakable composure. It was as though she were waiting, letting him reveal more of himself with every extra word. The audience shifted uneasily. Some applauded faintly, eager to signal their approval of Peterson's jab, while others groaned, whispering indignation at the arrogance on display. Reporters hunched over their laptops, their screens glowing as they fired off first drafts of articles that would carry phrases like verbal slap and humiliation attempt. And still, Peterson pressed forward. "What we're witnessing here," he declared, sweeping his hand toward Crockett, "is the triumph of identity over merit. A politician elevated not by qualifications, but by sentimentality. That, ladies and gentlemen, is unfit leadership." His words sliced the air, intended to brand her not just in that moment, but in the collective memory of everyone watching. The sting was undeniable, but so was the sense of overreach. He was no longer debating policy. He was attacking essence, questioning her right to even stand on that stage. It was a gamble that could only end two ways: complete domination or catastrophic miscalculation. Crockett's eyes locked on him, her face steady, her gaze unwavering. The room seemed to contract around her, every camera lens narrowing to a pinpoint focus on her expression. She inhaled slowly, a gesture so subtle yet so commanding that even the restless audience stilled. The sound of clicking pens stopped. The air felt heavier. Peterson, sensing the silence, smirked again, mistaking patience for defeat. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, as if daring her to respond. The imbalance of energy was palpable. His arrogance swelled, while her restraint simmered just below the surface. The tension became unbearable. The murmurs in the crowd rose again, like a tide that couldn't be held back. "She has to say something," someone whispered. "She can't let that slide," muttered another. Phones recorded every angle, ready to beam Crockett's response across the digital world. She shifted forward in her seat, just slightly, and the audience froze. Her lips parted, but instead of firing back, she paused, letting the silence stretch again. It wasn't hesitation, it was control. And in that pause, the balance of power began to shift. The cameras caught every flicker, Peterson's smugness wobbling into confusion, the audience leaning closer, the journalists pausing mid-keystroke. The moment had transformed. What began as an attempted takedown was now a duel, the outcome uncertain, but the stakes higher than ever. Then, with the room bracing for impact, Crockett reached for something Peterson never saw coming. The pause hung heavy, so weighted that even the air seemed reluctant to move. Then Jasmine Crockett leaned in, her hands steady, her eyes locked not on Peterson but on the microphone itself, as though addressing something far greater than the man across from her. She did not raise her voice. She did not rush. Instead, she reached into a slim folder resting at her side, pulled out her phone, and with deliberate calm, tapped the screen. A crackle of static, then a voice. Peterson's voice filled the hall at first it was faint but unmistakable. "They'll never admit it," the recording began, his cadence slower than in the present. "But sometimes the goal isn't truth. The goal is to control the narrative." Gasps rippled through the audience like a wave. Heads turned, eyes widened. The voice continued, playing back Peterson's own words from a previous, less public setting. "You undermine them, you discredit them, and it doesn't matter if it's accurate. Perception is stronger than reality." The silence in the room deepened, every ear straining to catch each syllable. The man who had just accused Crockett of being unfit was now caught in the act of laying bare his strategy, revealing not truth, but manipulation as his weapon of choice. The smug smile that had played on Peterson's lips moments before faltered. His jaw stiffened, his eyes darted briefly toward the audience, then back at Crockett, as though scrambling to assess how much damage had been done. Crockett said nothing. She didn't need to. The recording spoke louder than any rebuttal ever could. She let it play. "And if they push back, you call them unqualified, unfit, emotional. The trick is to sound calm, even superior, while you chip away at their credibility. That's the point. That's the win." By now, the murmurs in the crowd had turned into audible shock. "Did he really say that?" someone whispered. Phones shot up, recording the moment, live streams multiplying with every second. A hashtag began to form even before the audio ended, spreading across the digital universe like wildfire. Peterson shifted in his chair. He tried to muster a smirk, but it came out jagged, forced. His fingers twitched against the table. For once, he looked unsettled, as though the script he had relied upon for years had been ripped away in front of millions. Crockett let the recording run its course. Each phrase landed heavier than the last, painting a portrait of a man who weaponized language not to seek truth, but to distort it. The contrast could not have been clearer, the Peterson on stage branding his opponent unfit versus the Peterson on tape, admitting that truth was less important than winning the perception war. When the audio finally clicked off, the silence was deafening. For a beat, no one moved. Then came the explosion, a thunder of gasps, shouts, applause, and disbelief colliding in one eruption of sound. The entire hall seemed to tilt on its axis, the energy surging toward Crockett as though she had single-handedly flipped the narrative upside down. She sat back in her chair, still calm, still composed, eyes steady on Peterson. No gloating, no grin, just a quiet strength that radiated across the room. It was as though she had been waiting for this moment all along, and now that it had arrived, she would not need to embellish it. The truth, his truth, had done the work, for her. Peterson cleared his throat, leaning toward the mic. "That recording," he began, but the words cracked in his mouth. The audience's jeers drowned him out. Every attempt at explanation sounded thinner, weaker, less certain. He tried to raise his voice, tried to reclaim authority, but the spell was broken. The man who prided himself on control had lost it, visibly, publicly, irreversibly. Crockett spoke at last. "Unfit, you said, but the only thing unfit here is the arrogance of thinking that manipulation is strength, and that silence will let it pass unchecked." Her voice, steady and resonant, cut clean through the noise. The applause that followed was immediate and overwhelming, rising in waves, drowning out whatever Peterson had hoped to say next. The cameras drank it in. The journalists' fingers flew across keyboards, capturing the story that had just rewritten itself in real time. Clips of Peterson's exposed strategy were already circulating online, side by side with Crockett's calm takedown. Commentators would later call it the moment the debate ended. For those in the room, it was something more visceral. The crack of glass as an image shattered, the instant when arrogance met its reckoning. Peterson sat back, his face rigid. His hands clasped tight as if to hold onto something solid while the ground beneath him gave way. He stared at the table, at the crowd, anywhere but at Crockett. The man who had entered the room to dominate it now looked diminished, cornered. By his own words, Crockett didn't press the advantage with more accusations. She didn't need to. Her restraint amplified the humiliation, leaving Peterson's downfall framed by his own voice and her silence. It was the ultimate reversal, the villain unmasked not by fury but by patience, the hero vindicated not by shouting, but by proof. The hall was electric, a storm of emotion swirling between outrage at Peterson and awe at Crockett's composure. Students in the audience cheered, lawmakers clapped. Ordinary citizens wiped at their eyes, caught between laughter and disbelief. It wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a revelation. For years, Peterson had thrived on controlling the perception of others. Tonight, perception had turned against him, and Jasmine Crockett had become the mirror in which his contradictions were laid bare for all to see. And as the final words of that recording echoed, the fallout began instantly. The recording had barely stopped echoing when the shockwave began. First came the gasps in the room, then the thunderous applause, and within seconds, the moment was everywhere, splintering across timelines, feeds, and screens like glass hitting concrete. Hashtags erupted before the debate even concluded. Guess unfit backfire, Shashas Crockett McDrop. Receipts don't lie. TikTok clips of Peterson's stunned face looped against booming bass tracks, stitched with Crockett's calm expression as the audio exposed him. Twitter lit up with side-by-side memes. Peterson crowned with arrogance on one side, Crockett crowned with truth on the other. It was a cultural detonation. Late-night comedians raced to write punchlines before the ink on their cue cards dried. "Imagine getting owned by your own voice," one quipped, as laughter rippled through studio audiences. YouTube commentators streamed instant reactions, breaking down every second of the takedown as though analyzing a championship knockout. On Instagram, Reels transformed Crockett into a folk hero, layering her poised silence over triumphant soundtracks, captions proclaiming, "This is what dignity looks like." But the response wasn't just comedic, it was emotional. across Facebook. Groups and TikTok duets, people shared their own stories of being dismissed, belittled, told they were unfit for spaces they had every right to occupy. Crockett's stand had become their stand. Viewers posted tearful reactions, writing, "I felt seen tonight, and she carried us all in that moment." Communities of color, immigrant families, women long silenced in boardrooms and classrooms alike claimed her victory as their own. Meanwhile, mainstream media scrambled. Networks that had once platformed Peterson for ratings now led with headlines like, "Peterson exposed, recording contradicts his own words." Newspapers ran front-page spreads showing Crockett mid-silence, letting the audio destroy him. Editorials declared it a turning point, not just in the debate, but in the larger war of ideas. Analysts spoke of it as a fracture in Peterson's brand, one that couldn't be smoothed over with another lecture tour or book signing. The ripple effect reached political corridors, too. Colleagues of Crockett congratulated her publicly, tweeting praise that doubled as a warning to anyone else who might underestimate her. Activists and community leaders seized the moment, urging supporters to recognize that courage and preparation, not arrogance, win battles. Even celebrities chimed in, amplifying the clip with captions like, "This is how you handle bullies." And then there were Peterson supporters. Some rushed to defend him, claiming the recording was taken out of context. A smear. But even in their protests, their tone carried an unfamiliar strain. Desperation. The clip was too clear, the words too damning. For once, the spin was not sticking. Online forums that once echoed his every phrase now bristled with infighting. Some clinging to loyalty, others admitting unease. The memes, however, were merciless. Split-screen edits compared his smug unfit with the recording's confession of manipulation, the caption reading, "Play stupid games, win stupid prizes." TikTok users slowed the moment down, zooming on his faltering smirk as though it were the face of arrogance meeting its reckoning. Even sports commentators borrowed the imagery. That was less a debate and more a knockout punch. The velocity of it all was staggering. Within hours, Crockett's following had doubled online. Her campaign donations spiked, small dollar contributions pouring in with messages like, "For standing strong," and "Thank you for speaking for us." In living rooms across America, people replayed the clip not because they needed to see Peterson undone again, but because they needed to feel that rush of validation one more time. The shockwaves rolled outward, uncontainable. What had started as a calculated insult meant to humiliate one woman had become a cultural reckoning, exposing the fragility of arrogance when confronted with truth. But beyond the headlines, this moment carried a lesson far greater than one debate. When the roar of applause finally settled into a steady hum of energy, Jasmine Crockett leaned once more toward her microphone. The smirk had vanished from Peterson's face, and in its place was a silence he could no longer command. But Crockett didn't speak to him. She spoke to everyone else, to the room, to the cameras, to the millions watching from their homes. "Unfit," she repeated softly, almost like she was tasting the word anew. "That's the label that gets thrown at people like me, at women who speak their truth, at communities who dare to rise, at families who come to this country to work, to sacrifice, to dream." The message has always been the same. You don't belong. You don't deserve. You're unfit. The room stilled. Her voice wasn't raised, but it carried a power that filled the space. But the truth is this: dignity cannot be stripped by arrogance. Truth cannot be erased by manipulation. Representation cannot be dismissed by elitism. We are more than the insults hurled to keep us silent. We are the living proof that service and sacrifice are stronger than cynicism and scorn. It wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a reframing. Crockett transformed Peterson's insult into a universal mirror, turning his attempt to diminish into an anthem of resilience. Every word invited the audience to step inside the moment, to see themselves in her story, to feel the weight of every time they had been told they were unfit, and to taste the vindication of standing tall anyway. This is what fitness looks like, she continued. Not the absence of flaws, not the privilege of platforms, not the arrogance of believing your voice is the only one that matters. Fitness is found in service, in standing up for those who have been knocked down, in refusing to bow when told to disappear, in speaking not just for yourself, but for all who've been silenced. The crowd rose to its feet. Applause thundered, not just for Crockett, but for the dignity she carried and the mirror she held up to them all. It was no longer about the clash with Peterson. It was about every viewer, every listener, every person who had ever felt the sting of dismissal. In her words, they found not just validation, but victory. And that was the lesson. Arrogance will always crumble because it feeds only on ego, but dignity endures because it feeds on truth. Manipulation may win headlines, but it cannot win hearts. Elitism may build towers, but it cannot build communities. In that hall, something larger than politics took root. People weren't just cheering for Crockett. They were cheering for themselves, for the idea that justice and representation can still triumph over arrogance and dismissal. They were cheering for the reminder that the American story, when told honestly, is about resilience, sacrifice, and the relentless demand to be seen. Because in the end, it wasn't just Crockett who stood taller that night. Jordan Peterson called Jasmine Crockett unfit. He meant it as the final blow, the line that would echo louder than her voice. But instead, it became the spark that revealed his own contradictions and magnified her strength. With a single recording, Crockett flipped the narrative, dismantled arrogance, and reminded everyone watching that truth, dignity, and resilience will always outlast manipulation. This wasn't just a debate moment, it was a cultural turning point. Millions saw the difference between arrogance cloaked as authority and dignity rooted in service. Millions witnessed what happens when those told to sit down refuse to bow, when those branded unfit show the world exactly how strong they are. And here's the truth. This story doesn't end in that debate hall. It continues with us, with every person who shares Crockett's courage, with every voice that refuses to be silenced, with every community that deserves to be seen and respected. So if you felt the power of this moment, don't let it fade. Share this video, subscribe to the channel, and be part of the movement to amplify voices that matter. Leave a comment about the times you've been told you were unfit and how you proved them wrong, because your story is part of this story. Arrogance. We'll always try to write the script, but together, we can flip it. Dignity will always belong to those who claim it. Truth will always belong to those who speak it, and representation will always belong to those who fight for it. This is more than politics. This is about who we are. And tonight, Crockett reminded us all, no insult, no arrogance, no dismissal is stronger than the power of standing tall.